This is the final segment of my lecture on subjects of international law other than states, and I've talked about a number of them. I'm just going to go through now more briefly some of the other types of international actors that have a presence and are in some way or another engaged with international law. So I've already referred earlier to indigenous peoples, but let me go back here and explain that this is a growing body of law. We do not yet have a proper universal treaty that ensures the rights of indigenous peoples. We have this declaration, the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly a little over a decade ago. And it is, I think, fairly universally accepted, but because it's a declaration, it lacks the kind of teeth it may need for enforcement. We have a couple of treaties dealing with indigenous peoples that were enacted that were adopted within the International Labor Organization, which is the union labor branch or agency of the United Nations. But those treaties have not proven to be very helpful. They haven't been very widely ratified. And the first of them, which was adopted many years ago, was really quite patronizing towards indigenous peoples and treated them as people to be quote unquote civilized. The second one was much more progressive, but it's still proven to be inadequate. So this is something on the agenda and something to come, and it's an area of fundamental rights that's going to, I think, continue to grow. We have a similar place, but an uncertain one for minorities. When I use the term minorities, I don't mean any group that's in a subordinate position. We're talking about minorities that are identified by ethnicity or nationality. In Europe, we often call them national minorities. At the UN level, we often prefer to talk about ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. But ultimately, there's not a huge amount of confusion about what those minorities actually are in most cases. There are occasionally debates. They've had arguments, for example, about whether groups like travelers in Britain and in Ireland and elsewhere can claim to be ethnic minorities or not. But usually this is not that controversial about their existence. The question is what their rights are. And as with indigenous peoples, we don't really have an adequate treaty at the universal level. We have a very, very modest treaty dealing with minorities within the Council of Europe. So that means it's like it's closely related to the European Convention on Human Rights. But at the global level within the United Nations, we don't have a treaty on minorities, and there doesn't appear to be one on the horizon. And the rights that are recognized, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, recognizes, well, it doesn't say they're rights of minorities. It recognizes the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And so Article 27 of the Covenant says that persons belonging to minorities have the right, together with other members of the minority, to, and then it says, to enjoy their culture, to use their language, and to practice their religion. And these are rather modest offerings in effect, because the right to practice their religion is already secured by freedom of religion. The right to use their language is already secured by freedom of expression. It doesn't really give them a great deal. And what minorities sometimes want is to be able to have schools, publicly funded schools in their language that they control. They don't get that with a universal treaty. Again, they may get that from specific treaties, and there's a long tradition of this. It's a body of international law that has been around, going back to the 17th century. We have some sort of place for recognition of the rights of minorities in the early international treaties. Corporations, or sometimes this goes under the label business and human rights, corporations, especially transnational or multinational corporations, are hugely important. There are transnational corporations with resources and budgets bigger than those of many small countries. And they're extremely important. And they are creatures of states, really, because a corporation is a mythical, ethereal entity that exists because it's authorized by a law. And that must be, there are no international corporations. There's no international law capable of creating corporations, I don't think. But so they're created by national law, and then they operate internationally. And this raises all kinds of difficulties. They don't always do good where they go. They are often in places away from the place where they've been incorporated, where their head office is, and they're there to exploit and to make money. And as they'll always say, they're there for the benefit of their shareholders. But often the benefit of their shareholders is not the same as the interests of the people who live in the country or who work for the corporation. So here again, the law is rather soft, but it's taking on a growing, there's an increasing place for it. Really, when I say corporations, we all know from law school that a corporation is not the only way to do business. So it's technically possible that we could include other types of commercial entities like a business partnership or something. But essentially, we're talking here about multinational corporations. But let me conclude with a couple of what I would call sui generis type of institutions. The International Committee of the Red Cross, headquartered in Geneva. It is, in a legal sense, it's a creature of Swiss law. It's created by Swiss law, and I think that the committee, I don't remember how many members it has, 10 or 15, the committee is appointed by the Swiss government. So it's not democratically elected or anything, it's a body, and it oversees the work of part of the Red Cross. This is the work of the International Committee. It has a huge budget. It has activities all over the world. It basically lives on contributions from states, and a big part of its role is to ensure that it's to intervene when there's armed conflict, but also when there are natural disasters and so on, to ensure that humanitarian protections are provided. There are references in treaties to the International Committee of the Red Cross, and it's given certain rights of intervention under the Geneva Convention. So it's recognized in the treaty that is universal as a body, but in many ways it behaves like a non-governmental organization, but they would resist, people at the International Committee of the Red Cross furiously resist the idea that they're in some way equivalent to an NGO. And then finally, I mentioned the Holy See, might be better known to some people as the Vatican. It's a little enclave in the middle of the city of Rome, the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. It is you could go there and you could buy stamps and post a letter. It in some ways acts like a state, and it has a diplomatic presence. So the Holy See, like the state of Palestine, is an observer in the United Nations General Assembly. It's ratified some treaties. It's been possible for it to ratify treaties, but it's not really a state. I mean, it would call itself a state, but it doesn't have all the attributes of a state. And some of the treaties, of course, it's not able to ratify for reasons. If you think about it for a minute, you'll understand. The Holy See is the only entity in Western Europe that's not a member of the Council of Europe and not a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's because to become a member of the Council of Europe, you have to be a democracy. And although the Pope is elected, being elected by a small group of old men wearing red coats, having a puff of smoke come out the roof, doesn't quite do it in terms of the requirements of democracy within the Council of Europe. So I could go on, we could make a longer list, we could talk about other types of international actors and participants at the international level. Perhaps in a future presentation, we would include non-governmental organizations and talk about their role. There is the term is recognized and understood, and all of these bodies are part of the landscape of public international law. So we can talk about any aspect of this when we meet in the classroom and explore some of the details. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer your questions. See you soon.